Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Melissa Kenney. I'm the Director of Knowledge Initiatives at the Institute on the Environment, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this People and Planet conversation. People and Planet is a public series launched as a space to have wide-ranging conversations about the many intersections of climate and the human and natural systems that shape our world. Before we start today, I want to begin by first acknowledging that the Institute on the Environment offices, like the rest of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, sits on the traditional and treaty land of the Dakota people, land that was taken from Native people. As a scholarly community committed to building a sustainable future, it is particularly important to acknowledge the Dakota people on whose land we live, learn, and work. We understand that Dakota and Ojibwe knowledge systems are crucial ways of knowing and loving this place we call Minnesota, and we honor the people who keep that knowledge. I&E commits to improving and strengthening university relationships with our tribal nations. I also want to recognize that today, May 25th, is African Liberation Day, and we selected today for this climate justice conversation in part to commemorate the African Liberation Day. Happy Africa Day. Now, before we start, I have a couple quick logistics notes. If you have a question for our speakers, we're reserving some time towards the end of the discussion. Please add all your questions in the Q&A feature in this webinar, and we'll work to incorporate as many as we can. Also, we're recording the conversation and we'll share it along with any other resources mentioned in a follow-up message at the end of May. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, Dr. Nfamara Dampha is a research scientist in the Natural Capital and Ecosystem Service for Natural Capital and Ecosystem Services at the Institute on the Environment. Hi, Nfamara. Second, Dr. Sam Grant is the Executive Director for Rainbow Research and a member of the Institute on the Environment's Executive Advisory Board. Thank you both for being here. Nfamara, can I turn things to you?
Of course. Thank you very much, Dr. Melissa Kenney, for that kind introduction. This is such an important discussion that we hope to have with the audience, and Sam and I will lead the conversation. First of all, I'd like to say that you started the conversation with a very important issue, which is land acknowledgement and also recognizing African Liberation Day. Land justice is paramount to climate justice, and without the land on which we sit on, we wouldn't be able to work, learn, and make a decent standard of living here in Minnesota. So before we get started, I also like to sincerely welcome the participants from all across the world. This is really a clear manifestation, over 100 participants from all parts of the globe, that this is such an important discussion. And rightly so, Sam and I will try as much as possible to have a global conversation so that we build this relationship with all of you. Today's conversation is also possible thanks to the leadership of the Institute on the Environment here at the University of Minnesota, led by Dr. Jessica Hellman, of course, our Transformative Executive Director, and Julie Harness, our Dynamic Communications Director. And I also would like to thank Kimberly Long for all the strategic work that she's done behind the scenes to make this event possible. Now, my invited guest today is Dr. Sam Grant. Thank you, Sam, for honoring the invitation. You'll notice that Sam and I have a couple of things in common. We are both scientists. We're also both leading nonprofit organizations looking to address climate change and environmental justice and promoting systems change. Now, essentially, you may also notice in the conversation that we have some fundamental differences, of course, based on our life experience, our culture, education, our worldviews. So we may, to a large extent, agree on all the issues, or at least at minimum, agree to disagree on a number of issues based on our differences and perspectives. So to get started, Sam, I would like to say, as an introduction to the topic, that climate justice is a moral and an ethical obligation for all, especially so for those who have historically contributed more to the crisis. And that climate reparation and climate financing is not international aid, it's not development aid, it's not charity, especially to those communities that have been and continues to be disproportionately impacted by these climate catastrophes. Now, as Melissa mentioned, today by design, we decided to have this conversation on African Liberation Day to reflect on the impacts of climate change and the opportunities that climate brings in Africa and beyond. African Liberation Day to all of you celebrating this day. I remember Kwame Nkrumah once said, the former president or the first president of Ghana said, Africa's independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the entire continent. Today we say Africa's liberation is undermined by the climate emergency. So may I welcome you, Sam, to provide your welcoming remarks before we dive into this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nfamara, and thank you to the people who are here. There is a Dagara shaman who has a quote that is at the front of Alice Walker's book, My Mother's Garden. And I love this quote partly because Alice Walker and my mother, Alice Grant, were good friends. And the quote from Subunfe Some says, "Until you have been appropriately welcomed, you cannot yet arrive." So I want to say to all of you who have taken time out of your busy schedules to be here with me and Nfamara and Melissa and Kimberly and Lisa, who is our captioner for the day. So thank you, Lisa, for playing that role. I want to say thank you for coming. This is an important conversation, and we're hoping that it will be a catalyst for continuing conversations as we look at the climate crisis from a lens that Nfamara and I share of there being a fundamental intersection of the climate crisis and anti-Black violence on the planet. While this is a celebratory day in terms of African Liberation Day, now the word liberation has been taken out and it's just Africa Day, I think that's problematic. I think it should be restored to African Liberation Day. And it is also, quite unfortunately, today marks the 3rd anniversary of the murder by police of George Floyd in Minneapolis, where the University of Minnesota is situated. And so it's a day to pay attention to the way that structural violence is deeply figured into the climate crisis. And so as we think about morality in the context of the climate crisis, who decides what is moral? If you look at the history of the Conference of Parties gatherings from 1990 to the present, the African climate negotiators have had very limited power from the inception. From 2009 to the present, they have increased their voice and power, but they still say, if you ask an African climate negotiator, are we being heard? What they want to see is that the voice is respected, and that's still not true. So it raises this question: how are power dynamics shaping the field of morality? And what role does ecological complexity play in shifting the playing field? Because morality shifts when there is a crisis, there is an opening for mutual morality, but that window closes back to default politics that ride on the back of different forms of unequal oppressive power dynamics. A question that I hold and Nfamara shares with me is, what level of voice and power do the world's majority have? And how do we increase their voice and power and coherence so that there's a common message from the climate majority to facilitate a response to the climate crisis at scale that takes care of the earth, takes care of the people on the earth today, and takes care of the future? And the final question, how do we build that power? We're going to look at some examples in our own work that we think are generative of this process of building mutual power. Thank you. You're on mute, Nfamara.
So the next 30 minutes of the conversation, the flow would be to really set the framework of the discussion, because justice can take different dimensions, and we can spend a whole day here talking about justice and climate. So we'll provide a working framework to guide the discussion. And within that framework, we're going to bring in issues and provide some solutions in terms of how we think about transformative systems change. Now, that being said, this first statement that Sam and I said and agreed to is that injustice any part of the world is injustice everywhere, and that climate injustice is exacerbated by social injustice, and that social injustice in many places is promulgated by racial injustice. Now, to engage you, the audience, if you agree that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, please use the chat box to type in justice for all, OJFA. Now, the science on climate is crystal clear. We know that climate change is the biggest externality of our time. Today, humanity is at war with planet Earth and with nature, a war that we can stop and build relationships and also be at peace with nature. So, Sam, how do you react to the statement that injustice anywhere is actually injustice everywhere?
So I took a break to look at some of the comments in the chat, and it's demonstrative of the fact that we are all over the map in our perspectives on questions of people's well-being, and this notion of justice, and even the narratives that we tell, the stories we tell about what we mean by justice and what we mean by mutuality on a small planet that all of our lives depend on. So certainly, Nfamara agreed that injustice everywhere is injustice everywhere, but that's not the way political fields currently work. So it's a question of how do we shape and shift morality to bend, as Martin Luther King Jr. talked about across his legacy of organizing and leadership in the civil rights movement in the United States, that over the long term, the arc of justice does bend toward justice. But how much does it bend, and whose perspectives on justice are finally included? So for those of you who do not agree with the proposition that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, on what basis, on what conditions do we actually have a dialogue with each other and stop living in intractability, which just facilitates ongoing wars and crises across the planet? But if you agree that injustice anywhere is injustice anywhere, then how do we actually shift the dynamics in the political field so that we're working more comprehensively together to facilitate substantive social change that benefits people in all bodies and all places across the earth? So certainly some of you will identify with some of these forms of oppression, but you'll reject others. I source from an intersectional environmental and climate justice framework, and I actually recognize that all of these forms of oppression are fundamentally linked to each other, and that we have to address them as a collective set. So we got to look at imperialism, capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, racism, xenophobia, and the list goes on. Go ahead, Nfamara.
So I think that connects to the idea that the root cause of the problem has a historical dimension. And that historical context is to think about these problems of colonialism, capitalism, and how that leads to the climate crisis that we live. Now, I personally think of climate change as a byproduct of colonial extraction of natural resources, the pollution that comes from industrialization and our attempt to achieve economic development. Now, often we will say climate neocolonialism is still here, and it maintains the same extractive and exploitative capitalist regime in which overconsumption is considered a better standard of living or a better measure of wealth and well-being. Now, what we need is a transformative climate governance structure or system. But this system is undermined by the same neocolonial institutions and racial systems, policies, and regulations. It is sad to say, still in Gambia, we still rely, and I believe in many African countries, we still rely on the same colonial laws that benefit the powerful, because those in power have less incentive to change the regulations to benefit the rest. Now it brings the point, how do we shift from relying on these neocolonial institutional setups or structures and systems to something that is more collective and regenerative. The special dimension of this is that for a moment, and for the purpose of oversimplification, imagine the globe as a watershed where we are all connected in a especially explicit way. Of course, if you are a staff at the Institute and the Environment, you notice that our executive director loves the watershed metaphor. Now, the idea is that we acquire different competitive advantages, positions of privilege, and degrees of vulnerability due to the spatial nature of the watershed. What happens upstream affects downstream relatives. And what affects downstream, in a way, affects everybody in terms of, if you look at downstream rivers, you look at fisheries and water resources, all of that. Within the climate context, think of mitigation for a moment. It doesn't matter where the emissions are coming from. Emissions from Gambia, from the United States, still contributes to global warming. Now, this metaphor shows that we are, in fact, related, not only that we are connected to each other, irrespective of our differences in space, in time, and in scale. So we are relatives. Can we think of each other as relatives for a moment? I'd like to quote Professor Kyle White, who says climate change is in fact about the timing of our relationship with each other. Kyle, if you don't know, is an environmental justice professor and a member of the White House Environmental Advisory Council. And he was very instrumental in advising the president on the development of the new environmental justice executive order that was signed by President Biden a couple of weeks ago. Now, I would like to say scholars like Kyle are influencing global thinking or rethinking about climate change as an issue of relationships that we have with one another, and repositioning of the role of institutions in coordinating and building public trust. The third context that many of you expect us to talk about is the decision context. Who makes the climate global decisions? You know that there is no such thing called the global government, so to speak. Yet climate change requires the widest form of international cooperation. This remains a challenge because each country, each nation is a sovereign state and makes its own decision by itself to some extent. However, to reach an international agreement, world leaders met in 1992 to sign the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the UNFCCC in Rio. And this convention came into force in 1994. And today ratified by almost all countries of the world, 198 countries, refers to as parties to the convention. Now, parties to the UNFCCC meet at Conference of Parties, held almost annually. This year's meeting will be held in the United Arab Emirates, where IONI sends students and staffs like myself to attend, observe, learn, and share experiences with policymakers and practitioners. Article 3.1 of the convention states that the parties to the convention should protect the climate system for the benefit of what? The present and the future generations of humankind. On the basis of what? Underline equity and in accordance with our common but differentiated responsibilities, irrespective of our socio-economic status. What this says is that parties agree that the developed country parties should take the lead, and the specific needs and the special circumstances of developing countries should be given full consideration. This is about 30 years ago. Governments realized one thing, that climate change is a threat, is a problem, and that equity dimensions need to be taken into consideration. Yet we've seen what? Failure in holding polluters accountable due to recklessness and all kinds of reasons. We fail public trust, and I think also we fail to implement public nuisance law under common law regime. Now, Sam, I would like to invite you to say, how do you think of the climate crisis as an environmental justice issue? You're muted. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So I think it is important to recognize that people from the continent of Africa and people from the African diaspora are joined in saying to the world that climate justice requires racial justice requires climate justice. People in womanist and feminist movements around the world are saying that gender justice is climate justice, and climate justice is gender justice. And yet the intersectional voices talking about trying to shift the narrative are still underwhelmingly represented in the climate change discourse that happens at the Conference of Parties. And if you look at all of the great work done by the scientists involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 1988 to the present, the climate scientists themselves will recognize that we have consistently underestimated the pace of climate impacts. So we have to do a better job of linking climate scientists with climate impacted constituencies and use an open science paradigm to push for more responsive clarity about how climate change is impacting people in different places around the earth right now today. We have to take responsibility in the global north to recognize the unjust ecological burdens on the global south through ecologically unequal exchange, through underdevelopment, and through something that more and more scholars are also calling cultural disordering. So there's not only one culture in the world, and yet in the climate discourse, we're not paying attention to the complexity of cultural worldviews and how they matter in shaping the way people are asking us to respond to the climate crisis. If your worldview is a closed worldview, when we say this is what matters to us and this is how it should be addressed, it's totally ignored because it doesn't fit inside your paradigm. So in too many ways, people who have alternative worldviews are denied equitable decisional power. And there's already significant loss and damage caused by climate change, and that loss and damage is not being adequately accounted for and paid. Shifting to the other side of the ledger, it's really important to pay attention to the indigenous people on the planet who are less than 5% of the global population, and yet they live in the places and lead in the places where the majority of our remaining biodiversity stores exist. So by defending the Earth's original defenders and partnering with Native nations and communities around the planet, we can put that down as a red line for the climate crisis and say, partnering with indigenous people is one of the most important things we can do to address the climate crisis at scale. So I encourage all of us to think about how do we partner with indigenous nations wherever we live to respond to the climate crisis on terms put forward by the indigenous nations directly. We need to invest in the agroecology movement globally to finance bottom-up approaches to climate change and link that for scaled impact within and across regions. We need to invest in and work with residents of urban slums and concentrated poverty tracts to take the initiative to co-create democratic shared ownership of green infrastructures that increase local health, generate healthier microclimates, and organize conviviality, a fancy word. It simply means what many indigenous populations around the world are saying: we need to move towards a politics of living well together instead of a politics that privileges profit over life. And then finally, we need to think about a paradigm and a process that links a intercultural politics to education across all scales, from preschool through PhD and postdoc, where we're engaging all schools with local communities and then working with scientists to facilitate a linkage of science, organizing social movements, and healing justice to facilitate local adaptive change that builds resilience in reference to the climate crisis. And I'll close by referencing this point by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He's one of the scholars who talked about this notion of climate apartheid. And I really appreciate that note of climate apartheid. And I'm writing a book on climate apartheid now that might come out in 2024, maybe 2025. I'll let you know for those of you who want to stay in touch. But what Desmond Tutu said is the destruction of the Earth's environment is the human rights challenge of our time. And for us to honor it and respect it and engage it as a human rights challenge of our time, we have to do a critical analysis of the failure of the human rights regime through the United Nations from 1945 to the present, or 1948 to the present, we're not up to task in the way that we're honoring that Declaration of Human Rights. We've regularly upgraded it to include the rights of women, the rights of peasants, the rights of indigenous peoples, but rights on paper do not translate automatically to rights in practice. So we have to really pay attention to how do we get at power dynamics. And while we try and figure that out, we're looking at this reality of increasing biospheric disruption, where we're messing with the basis of our lives in terms of biogeochemical flows, in terms of land systems change, in terms of biodiversity loss, and in terms of the climate crisis, and then the loss of water in landscapes and increasing drought conditions. And at the same time, we also see the degradation of ecosystem services across the planet. So Kofi Annan, who recently celebrated his birthday, led a campaign starting in 1995, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which ended in 2005. And it broke down all ecosystem services into 24 categories, and you see them here on the chart. And it assessed whether or not current human behavior was putting those ecosystem services at risk. And what they found in their analysis, which was an open science paradigm, partnering scientists with communities and with indigenous nations, they determined using consensus-based science that 15 of 24 ecosystem services were in fact in degraded status. And they recognize, if you see where the plus and minus signs are, that several areas were in ambiguous status, with some people feeling like, no, they're degraded, and other people feeling like, well, there's some positive things happening, at least in some aspects of this particular category, such as the use of ecotourism, at the bottom of the screen on the right, to move people towards greater ecological consciousness and common responsibility. So we have a crisis here. My own assessment of these ecosystem services, I put all 24 of them, by my own analysis, into significantly degraded status, which is a very sobering thing to say out loud, which is why part of the work that Nfamara and I are doing, along with others around the country and around the world, is really looking at nature-based solutions at scale to respond to the climate crisis. And finally, Vandana Shiva talked about ecological apartheid. I find it a really apt metaphor for what's going on. She talked about our division from the earth and the assumption of mastery of the earth as part of what human civilization does, the use of all the forms of oppression to divide humans from each other, and then the way that living in a world divided gets into our consciousness, and we socially reproduce divisions in the world without necessarily meaning to do that intentionally. It's just partly what happens. So we have all of these dynamics that are working with each other in the context of the climate crisis. So having given you those perspectives, I will turn it back over to Nfamara to talk about the environmental and climate justice issues that you want to highlight.
Thank you very much, Sam, for really bringing those key environmental and climate injustice issues around the world. I think one area that I would like to highlight is the idea of these unequal emissions from rich versus poor countries and the vulnerability related to that. You all notice Climate 101, that rich countries emit more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and yet they are the least vulnerable to climate risk impacts, including frequent floods, deadly landslides, extreme heat, and severe landslides, wildfires, and rising sea levels across the world. But here is where I want to put attention to that the emissions that are coming from developing countries, especially from middle-income countries, are significantly rising. And this will continue to be the case unless we decarbonize our economic activities, restore nature, promote a circular economy and sustainability, not just again for this generation, but for future generations. Now, this is difficult to maintain because the right to emit discussion comes in, that some developing countries, China for instance, will say they will peak their emissions by 2030 because they need to take care of their socio-economic development needs first. and then climate can wait. But this is scary. What is needed for us to be below 2 degrees based on the Paris Agreement is a 45% reduction on 2010 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Unfortunately, the United States, the whole of Europe, China plus India have almost exhausted the allowable emissions budget to keep 1.5 alive. China alone accounts for about 25% of global emissions. The rest of the world, poor developing countries, are asking for their fair share of the emissions. Isn't that a fair ask? It is, but it is really a scary path forward. It is not the path forward that we are advocating for. We want to decarbonize the economy. And if you live in the United States, in Minnesota, for instance, we're doing well in decarbonizing the electricity and the transportation sectors. However, Minnesota is still struggling to meet its GHG reduction goals by 2025. And if more aggressive measures are not taken, if nature-based solutions are not incorporated, Minnesota would not be carbon neutral by 2050. Imagine if you live in Minnesota like myself, you emit over 15 tons of carbon annually, compared to my elder brother, Lamin, who lives in the Gambia, who emits 0.24 tons on an annual basis. According to the Global Footprint Network, if we all live like the United States and we all desire to develop, that's why we have to rethink the way we think about development. We would need about 5 arts, 5 plants to provide the biocapacity that is needed to maintain that level of consumption. The second issue, Sam, I would like to talk about is that climate change is an existential threat to life and one of the biggest human-induced genocide of our time, linked to killing 5 million people on an annual basis. That is equivalent to twice of Gambia's population is being killed by climate change on an annual basis. Now, each of us here are responsible for reducing this vulnerability and preventing this ongoing genocide. According to a new study that linked extreme weather to mortality, almost 10% of global death could be attributed to abnormally hot and cold temperatures. Like in the United States, Black lives matter in Africa. In fact, indeed, lives matter in all parts of the world, especially for those disproportionately killed and stormed by the climate disasters. This includes severe droughts, deadly landslides, frequent floods, irreversible human displacement, loss of cultural identity, loss of cultural heritage, and massive destruction of places people consider as homes. According to the IPCC, over 3 billion people are highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. This is equivalent to 45% of the world's population. Our study in Burundi reveals that 98% of Burundians, like the 98% of the country is vulnerable to climate change. And due to the protracted nature of climate vulnerability, fragility, and extreme poverty in Burundi, 99% lack the minimum and prevent climate catastrophes. It is also important that we think about climate-induced displacement. Several studies reveal that climate change has actually displaced over 60 million people, especially in developing countries, who lack the basic minimum investment or capacity to deal with this crisis. When these people cross borders, they go to other countries, they're referred to as what? Climate refugees. However, the term climate refugee is not internationally recognized legally. The 1951 Geneva Convention on the definition of refugee does not include any drivers of climate. So if they seek for asylum in any country, they're not given status. This is not just a climate injustice problem, this is a human rights violation, as migration with dignity is everybody's fundamental right. In fact, you will notice that there are more internal migrants, internally displaced people in these countries than so-called climate refugees. The World Bank projected that this figure could be close to 200 million people by 2050. 86 million of those will come from sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at it from the Gambia's example, you notice that last year, just one single event in the Gambia, it was the biggest rainfall event ever recorded in the country for over 30 years ago. 40% of the country's population was affected. Thousands of people were displaced, including women and children. And the total economic loss to GDP was over 6.5%. The cost of one single event was equivalent, in fact, more than all of the climate finance the Gambia received in 2018. Here you can see a woman in the picture, Sally. Sally's picture looks exactly like my brother's picture, Lamin. The following morning when I woke up, Lamin sent me the similar picture. His house was filled with water. Household assets were damaged. Their kids couldn't go to school. Women couldn't access markets. Economic activities were disrupted. People couldn't even cook for the whole day due to flooding. So this is disheartening. But maybe we'll spend the rest of the time that we have, Sam, to think about what really makes us hopeful. Because this is a crisis, it's a big problem. But what are the solutions? How do we think about moving forward in a sustainable way?
Thank you, Nfamara, for all of those sobering statistics and stories, and I appreciate the question. Nfamara and I are not academics that sit back and study these issues. We're actively engaged every day of our lives in looking at innovative solutions at all scales. So working with corporations to see what they can do, working with branches of government to see what they can do, and working with grassroots social movements in the environmental and climate justice space to see what they can do. So here is just an example of some of the initiatives I'm directly involved in. Given the extreme difficulty of farmers of color in getting access to land in Minnesota, we have begun to raise money on a commons land partnership to get farmers onto the land in clusters. So farming together, as long as they agree to 4 principles: sequester as much carbon as you can through your farming practices and document that, bring back as much biodiversity as you can through your farming practices and document that, contribute to local living economies and document how that is making a difference in reducing the obesity crisis and also reducing the hunger crisis in local regions across the state. And then finally, cooperating with the other farmers. So we're building common agroecological knowledge for the future. We intervened in an initiative to look at replanting 1 million acres of forest in the Eastern Broadleaf Forest. And we said, let's do this in a way that honors a partnership with Native nations using a co-management paradigm, and maybe benefits from the examples of like the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin with the, with the sustainable forestry practices put in place there. We intervened in the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and said, we love the LCCMR, the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources. It doesn't get money to grassroots organizations. We need to complement it with a small grants program. We just won that through the Minnesota legislature. So there'll be about $20 million per year between now and, between 2024 and 2050 that goes to support environmental and community justice paradigms in communities across the whole state, urban and rural. We're forming local environmental justice councils in environmental justice communities, and then we're linking them together in a statewide environmental justice partnership to build common power and clarity about how to make sure that the Minnesota environment is equally great for every Minnesotan. And as we do this work, we're looking at the great work by Donella Meadows, who challenges us to do systems thinking. If we look at climate change discourse, we're hovering around playing with number 12 on the list. Looking at parameters and numbers, subsidies and taxes and standards. And we're not really getting down to number 1 on this list, which is really changing the paradigm of the way we think about the relationship of human beings to each other and the earth. And that's the area of critical work. Climate justice requires a relational paradigm for both science and public policy and human relationships. So we are on a journey to get ourselves there. Nfamara and I are working hard on it every day, and we're inviting all of you here on the call to join us in humanizing and relationalizing the climate discourse. Thank you, Nfamara.
So I know we want to entertain questions after a few minutes. I would like to talk about what gives me hope is that we need to improve our relationship with nature. We can protect people by protecting nature. In fact, nature offers tremendous benefit for mitigation. 37% of CO2 that's needed could be sequestered through nature-based solutions. If we don't have mangroves, for instance, 18 million more people worldwide could be affected by coastal flooding. You know what? Nature-based solutions are cost-effective, they're accessible, scalable, and manageable. So I would also like to highlight that since 2015, after the Paris Climate Agreement, we've seen an increase in financing towards nature-based solutions. Over 400 adaptation projects now consider nature-based interventions on the ground. And finally, I'm hopeful also because I see the determination of young people in advancing cost-effective and innovative climate solutions across the continent. From restoring degraded landscapes, promoting climate-smart agriculture to other forms of green innovation and technological solutions, from developing energy-efficient devices and deploying renewable energy technologies in rural areas to promote standard of living of the most vulnerable. 5 years ago, I founded an organization called Help Gambia, now led by Daouda. And I met Emmanuel in Burundi doing the same thing. Daouda and Emmanuel are mobilizing what? Public, private, and civil society resources to restore nature, protect land and water, and create employment opportunities for young people. What they're looking for is to increase finance, technical and technological support to advance and scale up their innovative solutions. So we'd like to say that we're open for questions. Of course, all of what Daouda and Emmanuel are doing couldn't be done without adaptive capacity to reduce loss and damage. I'm going to stop here because I know people are interested in hearing more on this question of loss and damage, but we're going to allow for questions so that we do not take all of the time that we have. So I'm going to stop here to allow for question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that there's probably going to be someone popping into the questions asking you to go into loss and damages a little bit. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is just turn to a few of the questions that have come through from our many attendees at this discussion. And one of the questions that came through was wanting to know more about the meaning of common but differentiated responsibilities as it relates to climate change.
That's a great question. So the recognition is to understand that there are differences in emission. There are also differences in the social and economic muscles of countries, right? We have common, we all responsible for the crisis, we all emit, but we have socio-economic differences. The United States and the Gambia cannot be at the same level. So how do we recognize the emissions that come from the Gambia as well as from the United States, hold both parties accountable, but realize that towards the solution, we have to look at their socio-economic status. So this is why they say come on, and that's where the equity dimension comes in. In fact, it is a leading argument for the loss and damage discussion, that loss and damage has to be based on the common but differentiated responsibilities of respective parties, from the accountability side to the response side in terms of addressing the problem. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Well, and that actually goes into the next one, because you kind of set that up, and we got a comment from someone in the audience who was like, yes, I am that person asking about loss and damages. And the question is, the standard loss and damage models try to compensate on purely economic basis. What would you like considered in a loss and damage approach?
Sam, you wanna?
So thank you for that question. I am, listening to Indigenous people here on Turtle Island, but also in Africa and also in South America. And what they're saying is that when we lose biodiversity on our landscapes and we lose our languages, we're losing the basis of our existence. And those things are priceless. So you really can't commodify culture and history. You have to take responsibility by listening to each other and doing some, correction of narratives about how did we get here and how do we begin to move from here to take shared responsibility. So I think as we look at loss and damage, there's a whole lot of listening that needs to happen by people in the global north to people in the global south, using some kind of, and this is going to sound a little crazy to some of you, but Sobunfe Some, who I started with, does these grief rituals. We need to do some grief rituals, which I think humanizes the conversation across our divides of privilege and pain, and get us to learn how to have a common democratic conversation, because just putting a price tag on loss and damage will never heal human and earth relations. Nfamara, what do you want to add?
Absolutely. I think I kind of agree further with what you've said, because it goes beyond the economic and infrastructure damages that often is on the headlines. It's about people and place. It's about culture, spirituality. I studied migration a lot, and I realized from the migration literature that people love where they come from. Trust me, they do. People want to stay at home. When they are displaced, there's nothing that can compensate for that. In Kiribati, they're a small island country. Their president says they need migration with dignity because climate migrants are treated as nobody. They don't have status, and this is difficult. So loss and damage becomes something that we cannot fix when it happens. We just have to deal with it. And one best way is to listen and to think about how we heal and reconcile, and how we build relationship and trust and take care of each other as relatives. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Everything that you're bringing up is the world as a global community, and one of the questions that arose from our audience is the oceans as part of our global climate, and more broadly, both oceans, but also that kind of context of international law and how international law can help to support or sometimes impede work and access to intergenerational equity and climate justice. What are your thoughts?
Sam, in my culture, the elder starts, so go for it.
Yeah, I appreciate, back 10 years ago, I was in a food justice and democracy conference here in Minneapolis, and there was a woman, Valerie Segrist, from the Muckleshoot Nation on the West Coast, and she put it beautifully. She said, "You all live under the laws created by your countries, which are imperial colonial countries. I live under different laws, which is the laws of the land, the air, the water, and the sea. And those are the laws we all need to pay attention to." And so a question I'm holding, and the reason that I really source from an open science paradigm is I really believe that it's necessary to democratize the practice of science. So the University of Minnesota has a strong constituency of science for the people. I think really important. So how do universities partner more comprehensively with communities impacted by the climate crisis to right-size solutions and sort of follow the leadership of people from these communities? So I think that public policy and law change take a while. And so I think that there has to be a way of organizing processes of pressure on law and pressures on policy so that they adapt more quickly to realities within the climate crisis. Nfamara?
I would go to the next question. I think I completely agree with that statement. I think that we have still a lot of questions there. It's a great response.
So building off of that, there's a number of colleagues joining us here that work within various university systems. There was a question that arose that asked about your thoughts on possible pathways for the role university staff and scholars, students, and scientists can play in democratizing science.
That is a marvelous question. Universities are great in many ways. That the science, the IPCC, the contribution is mostly coming from scholars at universities. So let's keep doing the science. The science is what brings the evidence, and that is what is supporting the decision-making process. So we cannot underestimate the importance of research in this work. When we think about the traditional way of learning and teaching at universities, we have to modify the curricula a little bit. We have to accept learning and unlearning some of the things that we were taught and some of the approaches that we conventionally would apply in research. We have to start imagining, thinking of how we can co-develop knowledge and recognize the importance of traditional knowledge in enhancing our understanding of the science. Trust me, those farmers are knowledgeable. Farmers in Africa, they haven't been to university. They know the climate system. They know what's going on. So we need to listen to their part of the story and how we can come up with solutions that addresses their needs. University research and university exchange programs is one thing that I've been advocating for. The universities like University of Minnesota could think about how we do promote more exchange programs with other universities in developing countries, where students learn about the science, think about solutions, especially from innovation and technology aspect of promoting justice and providing access to resources for all. So there are many ways that universities can help. I would advocate for more research, advocate for more exchange, and advocate for scholars. I've been in university classes where professors are like, that region is not my region of interest, and they are not very much interested in learning more about that region. I think if you are in the climate space, you should be willing to learn about all regions to the extent possible. You can be an expert in all, but at least fairly understand and travel to these regions and see what's going on. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nfamara. What I'll add is a critique of universities. A colleague of ours from Uganda said we need to end universities and replace them with polyversities, which means they begin from a place of acknowledging that professors maybe should spend more time sitting in the back of the classroom, honoring the wisdom that the students and the elders in their own family trees have, and really having a conversation at the level of commonizing worldviews, bringing worldviews into discourse with each other. Because too much of what passes for higher education is still very monolithic in its orientation. That's unacceptable. It was unacceptable 300 years ago, and it's unacceptable today in 2023. So we have to change our approach to education and really commit at every level of education to education for common liberation. Quick story. I created an early childhood environmental education program in Sierra Leone. And the first day of teacher education, I asked the teachers, what does a good day of learning look like for you? And their answer was compliance. And I began to cry. And I said, no. At the end of a day of good education, everybody should be levitating. And they all laughed and said, well, that's impossible. Human beings can't levitate. So I said, well, let me show you how. So we set up a process where the teachers followed the students got in a line. The first student got a chance to point out what was like curious to them. And all the students gathered around and had a dialogue on that student's curiosity. Then the second student did it. Then the third student did it. Then the fourth student did it. And at the end of that day, the teacher said, that's as close to levitating in a space of education I've ever experienced. This is participatory education at its highest vibration. That's what we need universities to begin to practice.
There's a lot of other questions, and I think it's a testament to the conversation that you all started. And so maybe what I can do is ask one final question, which is, well, and actually it's a two-part question because I can't help myself, is if you had one takeaway message for the people who are joining us here today, what's the one thing you want them to remember from this discussion? And particularly, at the request of one of our friends here, is can you share with everyone how they can join you in advancing climate justice?
So Nfamara put a title on this talk about morality. So my one takeaway message is a question for you. How do we, the big we, all of us, share with each other the journey of democratizing morality? If we democratize morality, we increase intercultural, deep ecological democracy, and that allows us to look at the interlocking aspects of a just transition that we need to share, and that allows us to braid in social movement energy with traditional ecological knowledge and foster common wellness, and that allows us to collectively heal all of our relations in a timely way. But right now, we still are siloed because of apartheid, and we get in our own way and we get in each other's way, and it's so counterproductive. It's time to really come together at the highest possible level. Swahili word, Harambe. Let's all be together.
Thank you. I would say, remember, regime systems change for climate change. We need to recheck the system. We need to promote representative justice, procedural justice, and distributional justice. Who makes the decisions, what procedures are taken, how are resources allocated, and who benefits. If we always keep thinking about these things, that would be very helpful. On the question of how you could engage with us, I think really thinking about what you as an individual could do. Support an organization that is leading climate action on the ground. Join a climate justice movement if that is your thing, to create awareness, advocate for, talk to your lawmakers to support climate justice, and especially support the fight for loss and damage. Because I go to these UN meetings and you sit down, the country reps are talking on behalf of you all here in the United States. What the message from the country, from the United States, the citizens' message is what they carry forward. If they hear more justice, more call for additional financing for loss and damage, they would support the cause. So let's do that, provide scholarship to folks that cannot afford to study. If you're able, I would say that these are some of the things that I would leave with the participants, and it's really incredibly amazing. Also, you can connect directly to email for us to talk about other things, engage and collaborate, think about research and all the other stuff that links to this work. So thank you very much for having us today.
Oh, thank you both, my friends. Like, thank you, Fama. Thank you, Sam. And thank you all for joining us today in conversation. You can learn more about the Institute on the Environment at our webpage, environment.umn.edu. We look forward to continuing this conversation on climate justice, and we also look forward to hosting you again soon at future People and Planet conversations. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.